I'm Julie Collins. I'm the national organizer for Red, Wine, and Blue, and I want to welcome you to our presentation tonight. Nora Gelperin, and she is actually traveling, so she may have to take her camera off, but she's going to be sharing with us about what sex ed really is. Take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Julie. I hope that folks can hear me, and apologies in advance that my camera's not on. As Julie said, I'm in a hotel with terrible Wi-Fi, but I appreciate everyone's time this evening, this afternoon to join in and learn more about sex education in elementary school. I'm really excited to have a conversation with you. I see some familiar names in the chat, which is great. So I know I have some sex education colleagues here with me. So please feel free to join in the conversation and add your expertise into the group. That would be really, really welcome. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive in. I just want to tell you a little bit about my organization, Advocates for Youth. All the free resources are available at advocatesforyouth.org. We're a national and international nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. We've been around for about 40 years. And my job as the director of sex education is that I work with schools, school districts, and state departments of education around the country to really look at issues related to family life and sex education from kindergarten through 12th grade. My passion are these grade levels. It's a little bit of the Wild West when it comes to sex ed, but we'll dig into that. And I also come tonight representing my perspective as a parent as well. So both here professionally and as a fellow mom. Boy, is it harder to be a sex educator when it's your own kid than when it's other people's kids. So this should be a fun conversation. So when we talk about sex education and family life education and elementary grades, there's sometimes a lot of interchangeable names. So I wanted to just center us with some of the different things you may hear kind of all referring to the same things. So sometimes this grade level and this topic is called family life education, sometimes human growth and development, particularly as we get to upper elementary around puberty. Sex or sexual health education is common. In some states, it's called abstinence plus education. In others, it may be called abstinence only, although that tends to be more for secondary grade levels. In some states, it's reproductive health education. And lastly, we often hear wellness education. So all of these things are kind of referring to the same general topic areas. It may just have different names depending on where you're joining in from or depending on what your state or your district utilizes by way of this topic area. And what we see in the news is a little frustrating to me because this really doesn't reflect the actual levels of support. But if you just see these headlines or just see the Facebook posts or whatever folks are posting on Instagram or TikTok, it really makes it seem like, oh my gosh, so many people don't want sex education, or so many people have so many concerns. Pitchforks are going to come out. We're going to storm the Board of Ed meetings. And while that has certainly happened in some locations, we know that it is not universally true. Contrary to the popular belief, there is wide support for sex education. You'll see some of these numbers are in the 80s and above. And one of the things that I learned recently about polling is that anything above 50 to 55% is considered consensus in polling. And so even though these numbers aren't like 100% or 95%, seeing these numbers be this high, particularly for elementary school, we can go to the next slide. It's really remarkable how much support there is, even if it doesn't feel like that if you look at the headline. So in elementary school alone, and this is a survey from the National PTA conducted a year ago, January, so it's just about 1 year old, but it is a nationally representative survey of parents with kids in elementary school. We see that these topics are polling really, really high. And the topics that you would expect are a little more controversial related to sexual orientation and gender identity are still above 50%. So this is really encouraging. We certainly have a long way to go, but this really does show us that for a lot of the topics we're talking about, we do have a wide majority. So we can go to the next slide and actually skip right over it because it's what we were just doing in the chat. Great, let's go to this one. So these are some of the bans that we know we've been facing. Many of you I know are incredible activists and warriors related to this. We could just go ahead and animate all of the bans on here. Thanks so much, Drew. You can really see that if you just are in a silo of looking at sex education or just looking at book banning, it can seem like, wait, what's going on? Why are we all of a sudden seeing all these bans in this one particular topic area? But when you kind of look at them in their totality, you can really see how organized this incredible extremist agenda is, and it's all connected, right? It's not that Roe v. Wade just happened to be overturned and then all of a sudden there were attacks on critical race theory, which isn't even taught in K-12, and then all of a sudden book bannings popped out of nowhere, right? It's all very much part of the agenda to control, scare, and confuse parents with the hopes that they'll vote in a more conservative manner. And so it's really the bans on sex education, the bans on what kids can read in libraries, the bans on what kinds of care trans and non-binary kids can get. It's all the same stuff. It's the same talking points. It's the same ban. It's literally like the Don't Say Gay bill that passed in Florida was lifted and copied in 8 other states and counting. So it's really part of that extremist agenda, which I'm guessing is not a surprise to any of you incredible activists and warriors in this room. So I wanted to just give you a quick snapshot of where sex education is required, where HIV education is required, where there's a combination of both, and where there's none. And so it's really interesting. A lot of people assume, oh my gosh, it's 2024. Of course there's sex ed. Of course you have to teach about puberty. Actually, there really isn't a national requirement for sure. And we know that even as just of a few years ago, there isn't even uniformity across state standards. So there are some states like Indiana, for example, that you're only required to teach about HIV. So kids in elementary still probably are getting nothing, maybe one class on puberty if they're lucky. There are some states like we see on the coasts that require sex education, and some of them in a really robust way. And that's exciting, but it's really a patchwork of laws. So I would start by making sure folks don't assume that sex education is already being taught in schools, because particularly at elementary school, this is when we often see the least amount of sex education of all grade levels. So that's really frustrating. I think some people still think like puberty is optional, so we don't have to talk about it when everyone goes through puberty. All right, let's go to the next slide and figure out who is teaching family life and sex ed in elementary school. It's really a variety of people. There's different qualifications and stuff. I would say from left to right, this is when we're seeing kind of the most sex ed being taught in elementary school is being done by classroom teachers. As you can imagine, most classroom teachers have little to no training in health education, let alone in family life and sex education. So it's often like dumped on them as one more thing that they need to do with not a lot of support. Some schools do have dedicated health and PE teachers, or they may have a PE teacher who is like, oh, by the way, you're also teaching health. They come to it with a little more training potentially, but maybe one class while they were in college. Sometimes we see school nurses kind of getting looped into it, particularly around puberty. Oftentimes school nurses are so overwhelmed with so many other things that they have to do that they have really limited availability. And in just a few schools, I've definitely heard of school counselors, particularly around like a social emotional learning, a character education, or potentially child sexual abuse prevention curricula. So it's really a whole range of professionals, but predominantly classroom teachers, and occasionally in the very lucky school, there might be a health PE teacher in elementary school. So let's go to the next slide. So what is being taught? We can go ahead and click through this and populate the screen. We know that as we think about high schoolers down to elementary school, we know that the most health education that includes sex ed is in 9th grade, a little bit in middle school. Often what I hear is one class on puberty, maybe 2 if you're lucky, but that's really limited as well. And then the least amount seems to be taught to our youngest learners. And these are the ones that really need that foundational concept. We wouldn't ever start teaching math by starting with long division or here are your multiplication tables, right? We would start with the numbers and the number line. And it's just like in sex education and family life. You don't want to start by trying to teach kids what consent is in sexual and romantic ways if they have no idea what consent is related to borrowing someone's crayon or playing with a friend's toy or something like that. So it's really important to lay these foundational concepts, because we know that then they grow and develop, and it needs to get more cognitively complex as they advance. So then let's look at who is in support of sex education nationally. Next slide, please. So these are some of the national associations that support high quality family life and sex education being taught across grade levels. No surprise that the major medical, public health, and education associations are all in support of sex education. And then you may be wondering who is opposed to it. Let's go to the next slide. So we know that some of the very typical groups that we're hearing about that are responsible for many of those bans that we were just looking at are the same ones that are responsible for propping up controversy, for trying to introduce issues that aren't even issues, like issues around pornography and, obscene materials and all that kind of stuff. I will tell you the organization that's in the middle of the screen, called the Medical Institute for Sexual Health. It's one of these ones that sounds really benign. It sounds really like, oh, I'm on board for medical people being in support of sex ed. This is a very well-known, very long-standing abstinence only until marriage group, and they've actually issued their own set of sex ed standards. I'll put that in air quotes if you could see me. And so be very careful if you hear of anything from the Medical Institute for Sexual Health, because it is not a legitimate public health or education organization. So let's go ahead. Speaking of the National Sex Ed Standards, the next slide will tell you a little bit about those. Some of the resources that you'll get after tonight's webinar include a one-pager that summarizes the National Sex Ed Standards. These have been around since 2012 and really across all grade levels provide voluntary recommendations about what schools should be teaching at different grade levels across different topics. So if a school, or if you as a parent, or if you as an activist are wondering like, wow, what do you teach in kindergarten versus third grade? Or what's the difference between fifth grade and eighth grade? This is a great place to look, because you can get a sense of developmentally and age and developmentally what's appropriate. So let's look at the next slide. This is the handout that you'll get after the webinar. It's just kind of a one-pager of them. We're going to be looking, obviously, we can animate the slide. We're going to be looking at those first two columns for second grade and fifth grade, just to give you a sense kind of what's out there. Obviously, just like with any other topic area, sex education and family life education really matches the developmental level of students. So we are not introducing concepts before students' cognitive readiness is appropriate in those grade levels. So in the sex ed standards and in most curricula, we do K1, 2, and then we do 3, 4, 5 together. So let's go to the next slide. So you might be asking, what is age and developmentally appropriate? We're going to start with K1 and 2. And I think here, yep, we can just populate all this. This is great. A lot of these things I think are very simple. They are really very straightforward and not really scary. And if you think about 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, maybe even an 8-year-old in second grade, these are the foundational concepts we want them to have, right? How to be a good friend, recognizing that every family is different and perfect just the way that it is, helping them understand that living things reproduce. I'm going to talk more about gender identity and correct names for genitals in the next couple of slides, so that's why they're highlighted in pink. We also obviously want them to know about what we call as adults bodily autonomy, but we would use the word safety and boundaries when we're talking with younger students. We really want them to know about how to keep themselves safe and how to get help if someone is trying to do something to them in a way that is unsafe. So there's a lot of emphasis on who are your trusted adults, who could you talk to if you or a friend needed help, how would you start that conversation, how would you make sure if it's not a parent in your personal life, who else in the school building. So really just making sure we set up safety, we set up families, and respect and boundaries related to being a good friend. A lot of people have questions about the gender identity piece, so let me share with you on the next slide a little bit about where that comes from. We know this has been one of the areas that's been most controversial, so let's go to the next slide. I wanted to share with you a piece from the American Academy of Pediatrics that really clearly delineates from the position of all of the pediatricians in the United States. They really are supporting that developmentally kids as young as 4 and 5 are really aware of what their gender identity is. Everyone has a gender identity. We may not have the most sophisticated terms for it at those ages, but we know very clearly by that point in our life, we could tell you, I'm a boy, I'm a girl, I don't fit in either, I'm a combination of both, whatever it may be, it is pretty well rooted by those ages. So that means when kids start going into kindergarten at the ages of 5, turning 6, they are really ready to understand what that concept means because developmentally they're already at that stage. That may change as they understand themselves better. They may communicate it in different ways as they grow and develop. But we know that most kids have a gender identity at those youngest ages, which is why developmentally, we just need to start defining terms, right? Making sure everyone can feel seen and heard and affirmed at those youngest grade levels when they enter our schools. And it's great to see it happen even earlier, right? In daycare settings and preschool, that's fantastic too. Let's talk a little bit now about using correct names for body parts. We can go to the next slide. I'm going to share all of this with you, this tip sheet from the AAP, the next study on the next slide, I'll share with you as well in that post email that you'll get. All right, so a lot of people ask me, why can't we just use like down there and private parts and, you know, all those kinds of cutesy names that maybe we were taught when we were kids? There's really important research about how protective it is when we use the correct names for body parts. One of the things that we know from studies done like this one is that if a child sexual abuse predator, and I'm sorry to bring up this difficult topic, but if a predator is going to select which child to prey upon, they're going to choose one that is ignorant or uninformed about what the names for their body parts are, because they are less likely to report. So actually, when we use words like vulva, anus, penis, scrotum, vagina, right, nipples, breasts, we are actually helping to protect kids against child sexual abuse because we're giving them the knowledge about what their body parts are actually called. They are more likely to report and more likely to report accurately, right? I once heard from a school counselor who had a kid talk about that her uncle was touching her lollipop. And she was like, oh, that's so nice. You guys were sharing a lollipop. Come to find out later, that's what the family called the vagina because they were too uncomfortable to say the words. And the child was trying to report that she was being sexually abused, but she didn't have the language. And just imagine how powerful it is for us as adults to be able to give young people and our youngest kids in particular the knowledge about their body parts and their ability to report should something ever happen to them. So that's why this is really, really important. And usually when I share this information with parents, lots of light bulbs go off, lots of support happens because they kind of didn't connect these two pieces together. So sometimes we just got to get over our own discomfort and practice saying these words out loud. All right, let's now think about upper elementary, and let's go to the next slide. We can look at kind of what's age and developmentally appropriate as our students are getting into grades 3, 4, and 5. So obviously the introduction of consent and personal boundaries kinds of starts to continue as we build on what does that look like with your friends? What if someone's not respecting your personal boundaries? How do you communicate your boundaries to someone that maybe wants to hug you, but that's not what you're comfortable with, or wants to kiss you on the cheek, but that's not what you are feeling in the mood for, right? Like all that consent and personal boundaries just gets more complex as students grow and develop. Obviously, these are the grade levels where we talk a lot about puberty. So many questions about body parts changing. Is my body doing what it's supposed to at the right time? Why do I get all this hair? What is going on? So lots of lessons related to puberty. And it's really important, hopefully, to start before students are in puberty, as opposed to like, oh, P.S., when you were bleeding last year, that was called your period. Like, good luck, right? And so we want to start those conversations beforehand so that students aren't really traumatized by some of the changes that their bodies might be going through, particularly wet dreams and menstruation. Those are the two that, you know, you really want to get ahead of so kids know that that's totally normal for their bodies. Gender expression, gender role stereotypes. This is when like everything seems to have a gender, whether it's a color or the instrument you play in the band or what you wear on Halloween. It feels like this is where our society unfortunately kind of says this color is for boys and only girls wear nail polish, and you know, you can only be this for Halloween depending on your gender. So it's nice to see some kids starting to really just be authentically who they are around their gender role stereotypes and the expression of who they are. And it's great when we can support them about just play with whatever you want to play, wear whatever you want to wear, do what makes you happy, as opposed to only boys and only girls do this, kind of that old school binary. And then lastly, I like to just share that this is obviously when kids start to, because of puberty, develop those hormones that make them look at people in new romantic ways. They start to feel those feelings potentially of attraction to other people. And that's usually when we need to start defining what sexual orientation is. Because as we all know, sexual orientation has nothing to do with who you're in sexual relationships with or who you touch in a sexual way. It's who makes your heart flutter, who gives you butterflies in your stomach, who makes your palms sweaty. And it's those feelings of attraction and wanting to be close to people that often predicts or defines what your sexual orientation is. So it really has nothing to do with sexual touching that comes later in life and developmentally in middle school, but we start to just kind of set up some of those concepts. So let's look at the next slide. There's some other topics that get introduced at these grade levels as well. We want to really normalize all the different ways that people come to become families and have babies, because it's way more than it ever was before. And kids have questions because celebrities are, doing surrogacy and having multiple fathers with babies from different people. And, we really want to make sure that every family feels affirmed and seen and answer questions. Very basic information about STDs, basically about transmission and safety. We want to make sure that they know about child sexual abuse and sexual harassment. There's a lot of bra snapping and wedgies and pantsing that's happening at this point. And so we want to really define some clear boundaries around personal boundaries and safety and how to make sure to intervene before kids are violated in any of those ways. And then lastly, trusted adults. So let's look at one last slide from upper elementary. These are actually questions from fifth graders that a friend of mine who teaches this grade level was kind enough to scan for me. So I'll let you just look at them in their own handwriting. So these are some of my favorites. Something about seeing them in their own handwriting that's like, oh my gosh, so many concerns. I love the is puberty horrible? Is it gross? Is it painful? What are tampones? I love their spelling too. It's just really pregnant. I love it. I love it. I could answer these all day. Great questions, right? Yes. Like they know the word tampons. Yeah, right? Still, right, Heather? After 20 years of teaching, these are the questions they're still asking. It's just hilarious. And sometimes it's like, wow, with all the information you're exposed to, these are still the ones that we're getting in our question boxes, but it's great. All right, let's go ahead to the next slide. Because I know many of you are here to kind of figure out how to respond to some concerns that may pop up around sex education. So we did want to give you some talking points. So we'll go through these one at a time, and then we're going to give you a handout that has all of these together. One of the biggest things that we hear is sex education in elementary school is just too explicit. They're too young. We must clutch our pearls and protect their innocence. I hear this. This is like the number one thing I hear. So we worked with some communication specialists, and I just wanted to share some of the talking points that we have found to be effective to kind of respond to this. Obviously, you don't need to say this whole monologue here, but really to talk about laying those foundational principles that could be built on later. Things like healthy friendships, respect, self-esteem, consent, and boundaries. If we don't provide those foundations in early elementary school, it's impossible to grow and to build onto those in middle school and high school. We also know that part of protecting their childhood is giving them a safe space to talk about these issues. For many kids in elementary school, that is someone in their family, that is around a dining room table with adults in their lives. And for some kids, it's not. So making sure that all kids, which is the responsibility of our schools, to help all kids learn and grow and thrive, have a safe space to talk is really one of the reasons why we need to talk about this in elementary school. So let's go to the next slide, where I get another very common response around, you can't teach this. You're indoctrinating our kids, not educating them. This is like one of my favorites, right? So one of the things that we know is really important to just kind of set the record straight is that sex ed provides accurate information to kids about their bodies and the worlds around them. Everyone should be treated with respect, and educators and teachers are telling them to go discuss the information that they've learned at home. So there's lots of great lessons that provide like a home extension activity. It's really about go talk to a trusted adult about what puberty was like when they were growing up, or go talk to an adult about when they learned about where babies come from and what did they learn. Share your values, share your cultural beliefs, all that kind of stuff, your faith traditions, to make sure that that kids are talking with family members, with adults in their family and in their community, so that they can have a nice, strong bond and know that there's someone in their world who they can always open up to and ask questions of. Let's do one last one. This is the one that just stops me in my tracks and makes me want to pull the covers over my head. So sex ed is grooming kids. This one I find so vile and repulsive because sex education actually helps kids protect them from grooming, but it's gotten twisted on its head and thrown at us as a real attack. So we know that, you know, as we were talking about earlier, a lot of sex education actually is protective around child sexual abuse. We help kids understand how to get safety. We help kids by protecting them by learning correct names for body parts. And this last line is one I cannot tell you how many school board meetings I've testified at where this is the line that I try to like leave everyone with, that we believe our kids' safety is more important than politics. And it's really trying to get at that there is a political agenda from an extremist groups in our country that is well-funded and well-organized, that is trying to make issues where there aren't issues. We have data and polling, we have science and evidence, we have the vast majority of parents and caregivers on our side, and we just need to kind of reiterate some of these talking points again and again and again, because there are folks trying to create controversy where there really is none. So let's go ahead to the next slide. This will be another, thank you, Justine. Oh my gosh, I want a t-shirt with that and a bumper sticker. I love that. We want to share this with you. It'll come in the email after the chat, mostly because hotel Wi-Fi is terrible. But it really just kind of lays out some of these messages kind of in a one-pager that you can take and share with others or share with your colleagues. We wanted to kind of give it to you all in a digestible place. So I will just take the next 5 or so minutes and share with you some resources for yourselves as parents and caregivers. And I invite all the amazing sex educator colleagues in the room here tonight, please also post your own websites, your own resources, ways that people can get in touch with you, because it really does take a village. And I'd love to make sure that your work is promoted. So all the folks, please don't hold back and share what you've got. So let's go to the next slide. I would be remiss as an Advocates for Youth employee to not talk about our free sex ed curriculum called Rights, Respect, Responsibility. It's K through 12. So if you're curious what these lessons may look like, you can go and download all 120 of them in English and Spanish. It's LGBTQ inclusive and affirming. It maps completely to the sex ed standards, and we make it freely available to schools, not only all over the US, but all over the world. And there are some versions available that are state specific, including one that's available for students with special needs. So invite you to check that out if that's ever of interest. Let's go to the next slide. Awesome. I see these great posts in the chat. Thanks, folks, for sharing your resources. This is really, really helpful. Amaze is a really big initiative through my organization. The most of the videos are for upper elementary and middle school, but there's this really nice selection called Amaze Junior. And one of the things I wanted to point out for you all, potentially as parents and caregivers, is that thanks to Debbie Rothman, who I think I saw her name in our group here tonight, who's this amazing, outstanding educator with brilliant books on sex education, we animated her, with her permission, of course. We took one of her brilliant sex education for parents workshops and kind of cut it into little bite-sized pieces, animated it so that if you as a parent want to know how to talk about this with elementary school kids in your own life, you could click on any of these short videos. They're like 2 or 3 minutes long. They've got some really great recommendations and advice. And then under that, there are videos for parents and caregivers and their kids to watch together. Where do babies come from? Why does my body look different than yours? All those kinds of things. So there's really great resources there as well at amaze.org/junior. And then the next slide just shows you a little bit about the typical Amaze website and some of those resources. So if you've got any young people approaching puberty or social media issues or depression or social anxiety, all of these. There are about 200 different videos available. We put out one a month. Many of them are translated into lots of different languages. I think we have 50 languages and counting. And there are also discussion starters under every video for parents and caregivers, as well as for educators. So if you wanted to use one, maybe sit together for 2 or 3 minutes. Sometimes I text one to my kid. I say, watch this. We're going to talk about it next time we're in the car together. And then I use some of the discussion prompts under the video to kind of help me get started. So that's available. A couple more resources on the next slide. PlannedParenthood.org, in addition to doing a lot of great work in the clinical space, also has some really wonderful resources for parents and families. So I wanted to just make sure people were aware of this whole series of resources, not just, in addition to all the great clinical work, they have a brilliant and amazing education work as well. And so it's something to definitely check out if you've not seen it before. The next slide is one of my absolute favorites from our brilliant colleague, Melissa Carnegie. It's called Sex Positive Families. And I just want to note that this is a .com, but it is a very safe .com. And I see Justine already posted it. So awesome. We're on the same page. You can go ahead and hit the next one because it'll just animate. There's all these different topics. And what's really cool is you can click on a topic and then you can click on the age. And she has put together this massive list of videos, podcasts, books, websites, all this kind of great stuff. And you could filter it by topic and or grade. She also runs online workshops, which are really amazing for parents and caregivers as well. So amazing work from Melissa Carnegie at Sex Positive Families. I highly, highly recommend. And then one last one, sorry to go on and on. There's just great stuff happening at these grade levels that I think don't get as much airtime as some of the ones for the adolescents. So talkmore.org is another great website, lots of free parent planners where you can kind of talk about how to get prepared, what to say to your young person, answering difficult questions, how to train yourself to get more comfortable. There's lots of great free downloadables. Lauren is also the woman behind this, Lauren Baranos. She's great and does a lot of online and in-person workshops as well. So definitely recommend checking out talkmore.org. So let's go to the next slide. One of the things I always get frustrated about during these presentations is sometimes I'm like taking copious notes and I'm trying to remember the names of all of these places to go check out after. So I wanted to put them all in one slide. If you are wanting to take a picture of this, or you'll get the slides after the fact where it's all in there as well. But if you want to get a picture of these particular resources so that you can check them out later if you didn't get a chance to copy them down, I wanted to just put them all in one slide to make it a little bit easier for you. Danny, thank you so much for that comment about the habit of saying parents and caregivers. Yes, as a grandmother of 9 and past foster parent, that is so important. That's wonderful. That's great. Okay, so my final recommendations, and then we'll leave some time for some Q&A. Next slide just shares some ideas about what you can do now that you know a little bit more about family life education at the elementary grade levels. I really encourage you in your role as a grandparent, as a concerned citizen, as a taxpayer, as a parent or caregiver, to think about how you can reach out to schools in your area and really check in and see what they're covering. I will tell you, all of the teachers that I talk to only hear from parents when they have a complaint. They very rarely get a thank you or how can I help or what can I do to support you. So really think about ways, if you are supportive of these efforts and these grade levels, that you can be proactive around that. I know that would be so incredibly welcome. Also think about ways that you can get involved. I know of some folks down in Florida where I know it's just a dumpster fire, but anyway, they're going to board meetings just with the same color shirt. They always wear red to the board meetings. They just have I support sex ed on them. They come with signs. They do not sign up to speak. They're very polite. They follow the rules. And it just shows the board that there are people that do support sex ed and that there are parents that can behave in ways that are civil and we can get along and we can show our support without having to be disruptive. So think about, if you can't go to a school board meeting, could you write a letter to the superintendent? Could you write an op-ed in a local paper? Could you post on Facebook for your friends and family that this is, what you're learning about and what you care about? I think that would just be really helpful to kind of counter this narrative that so many people are opposed to sex education, because we know that's just not the case, but it's hard to break through all of the violent conversations that seem to make headlines all the time. And lastly, just to come home to something I said earlier, don't assume that sex education is being taught in schools. It's really great to just check in, express your support, see what you could do to help. Sometimes even I've bought a book or two for a local classroom library when they didn't have a book that showed a diversity of families. Or maybe I recommended a website to a teacher who wanted to learn more because this was their first time teaching. Any of those kinds of things can be incredibly helpful. And it looks like Debbie put in her information as well, which is wonderful. I really, really recommend you check out her resources. They're brilliant, as many of the others are that got posted in the chat. So Drew, yes, let's go ahead to the next slide, and I will turn to Julie and kind of see what questions we had come in that I did not get a chance to address yet.
All
Thanks.
right. The first one, someone asked if you had any numbers on teaching sex ed and teen pregnancy.
Yes, I can direct you to, I'm just going to type it in while we talk. There's this great organization called SECUS Sex Ed for Social Change, and they have this map on their website that overlays where sex education is taught in terms of the laws and what the rates are of teen pregnancy. And surprise, if you don't teach sex education, your rates of unintended teen pregnancy go way up. So think about places like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama in particular, parts of Florida. Those are the places in particular that have much higher rates of unintended teen pregnancy, in part due to the lack of sex education, but also in parts due to systemic racism, to lack of infrastructure related to family planning clinics for young people, to all different kinds of things that may be going on when it becomes, yes, Idaho, thank you, Joe, when it becomes a political issue and not a public health issue. So I definitely recommend checking out SECUS. And I'm going to put in one more. The Guttmacher Institute is another really great one that analyzes data like that. So between those two, you should be able to get those statistics that you're looking for sure.
All right. And then when we were looking at the questions that the children asked,
Yeah.
someone said it seems that girls were asking more than the boys. How do we reach each group effectively so that
Yeah.
and I know that there's a difference when they're younger and their maturity, so that
Yep.
probably has a lot to do with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I do get this question a lot from building principals and health PE supervisors about should we be separating by gender when it comes to teaching about puberty? Won't that make everyone more comfortable? And actually, it's quite the opposite. What makes more people comfortable is having a comfortable and trained teacher teaching about puberty. So it doesn't have to be a male PE teacher teaches the boys and the school nurse teaches the girls and they pull down the shades and no one talks about it. It really is more important that whoever is teaching about puberty is someone who's comfortable, who's trained, who feels at ease answering questions, who's not overwhelmed by this topic, who's got support from their school administrators. And keeping kids together, particularly for kids that are non-binary and non-conforming, is critical. You don't want to make kids that are trans or non-binary arbitrarily choose between a binary around gender that really does not exist anymore. So keeping all kids together. And then as educators, we really need to be very savvy about making sure we create a safe, comfortable learning environment. Sometimes that may be doing something like, I saw one teacher do a giggle minute. So the beginning when they're starting to talk about puberty and they're starting to say words like penis and vulva and breast and we just can't handle ourselves. She gave them 60 seconds on the clock to giggle and laugh and fall out of their chairs and all that good stuff. And then it's like, phew, we're going to get that out of our system. Now we're going to try our best to use the correct names. We're going to try our best to approach this topic with the care and sensitivity we would with any other topic in school. Let's dig in. And I just thought that was such a great way to really make sure that the students knew while it's really normal to be uncomfortable and feel embarrassed about this, it's also really normal to be curious and are excited to learn about this. And let's figure out how we can all have a good time and learn about how to keep our bodies safe as we're growing and maturing. So it's really more about the preparation of the teacher and that climate and less around the gender of the kids.
Okay, so that's the questions that I had.
Okay.
Nora, this was wonderful. Thank you. And it's so very informative. It always is.